Good morning, everyone. As Seb said, my name is Joshua Robinson, and I'm a professional civil engineer, and I was born and raised here in Charleston, and I've been studying Gadsden Creek really closely for about 20 years now, since I was a teenager and learned about the fact that Charleston only had one tidal creek left, and it was Gadsden Creek. And I heard stories from my parents about the old Charleston landfill, and so I'm really glad to be here today as part of this summit to describe some of what I've seen through the years and share some of my observations and ultimately some of my ideas from working on other projects in other communities very similar to issues with Gadsden Creek, and some ideas that I think that could work really well here. I also serve as adjunct faculty at the College of Charleston, but as a design engineer, I work as part of a 7-person team of scientists and engineers and designers. And we're Robinson Design Engineers, and we do what we call nature-based engineering for water management. And so what that means is we work, like all civil engineers, we work in the realm of community infrastructure, like you see here in the 11 o'clock position on the round there. We work on community infrastructure like roads and bridges and groundwater issues and flooding and things like that. And as water resources engineers in particular, our specialty is within the area of water management, things like flood risk reduction and water quality and groundwater. But then where we work in the area of nature-based solutions or nature-based engineering, it's that we want to do our work in a way that also creates ecological benefits. Because oftentimes work in water resources related to flooding and water quality means we're working a lot in streams and rivers and wetlands. And we want to do that work in a way that honors the resource and creates ecological benefits, not just for human communities, but also for the entire natural system. And so I want to talk a little bit about Gadsden Creek and my experience with it. Seb mentioned the work of the South Carolina Environmental Law Project, and back in June of 2022, I served as an expert witness in that trial and was able to really study very closely the permit documents, the proposal to fill Gadsden Creek, and spent a lot of time on site taking measurements and making observations. And so I want to share some of what I learned through that process with you today, and hopefully it'll help to inform the conversation for us today about ideas and demands related to Gadsden Creek and the Gadsden Green community. So, as you know, Gadsden Creek has been part of Charleston forever, and it's what we think of today as Charleston, the colonized version of Charleston. This is the earliest map that we have from the mid-1700s, and you can see very clearly 3 tidal creeks shown on the peninsula along the Ashley River, and Gadsden Creek is that northernmost tidal creek circled in black there. And you can see the other 2 tidal creeks. One of them at the lower end is now Colonial Lake, and the other one is Alberta Long Lake. And so Gadsden Creek is the only remaining free-flowing marsh and salt marsh and creek left on the peninsula. But what's really interesting is that the folks who made this map so long ago recognized how much area that it occupied on the peninsula, but also we know from just the science that has taken place in our area since then that Gadsden Creek has existed for at least 12,000 years. And that's a long time. And we know that because that's roughly how long the sea levels have been, roughly where they are. And we know that it takes salt marsh a really long time to develop, and it has taken our landscape a really long time to develop as the sea levels have come up and down through the years. And so we can confidently say that the salt marshes around Charleston and Gadsden Creek have been around for many, many thousands of years. 100 years later, after that previous map was made, there was this map made during the Civil War, and you can see a much more detailed depiction of the creek and the salt marsh and just how far up into the peninsula the fingers, the little tributaries of the creek went all the way up to the high ground of the peninsula, connected over to Halsey Creek. So this whole area really was characterized by the salt marsh and the community that grew up around the marsh and the creek. And then fast forward about another 100 years, after the peninsula had been urbanized and the shipping channel had been excavated. You can see there in the white area within the water, within the harbor, the shipping channel that had been excavated following the Civil War and through World War II, as the Charleston Naval Base became a very important part of the city, and the harbor was deepened and dredged. And then this map was made in the mid-50s, and you can see even then, you can see Haggett Avenue crossing the upper portion of Gadsden Creek, and you can see the really detailed natural channel, 3 natural channels really, within the salt marsh area. They're like Roland mentioned, that's the 100 acres that was there as recently as the early 1950s, within that black circle there. And then we know about the terrible things that started to happen in the mid-50s when the city began filling the creek with household trash. You can see, refrigerators and bags of trash and just household waste. And based on the records that I've reviewed and just reading about and studying how this type of landfill was done back then, we know that what took place was that these large cranes, like you can see there in the distance on the right-hand side, they excavated down into the marsh, into the soft pluff mud. They excavated down into about 12-foot deep trenches, because that's how deep they could dig. So they dug 12-foot deep trenches, and then they filled those trenches with trash. And then they put pluff mud back on top of the trash and leveled it off. And they kept doing that in rows, almost like farm fields. They did this in rows, would dig another row, fill it with trash, and then keep moving on down the line. And they did this day in and day out as the garbage trucks, you can see them there coming and going with household waste. So whatever the types of things we put in our garbage can, that's the kind of things that ended up in the marsh of Gadsden Creek. And 10 years later, you can see how that trash, they had moved in that pattern, digging those trenches and filling out toward the Ashley River, and then over toward the end of Spring and right there at the bridge just going over the Ashley River. So this went on for quite a long time. And as we know, the marsh was filled up until the early 70s, and they left, as Roland pointed out, left that 4 acres, 4.22 acres of the last official survey a few years ago. They left those 4.22 acres and filled in, the 96 acres there, give or take. And so this is a major portion of what remains today. And one thing that's really important to me, thinking about this as an engineer and thinking about this as a person who studies creeks and wetlands for my vocation, is that the reason this portion of the creek was left is because it had to drain all of the land of the west side of Charleston. The whole west side community drains through storm sewers and through the roads and drains down into Gadsden Creek. So Gadsden Creek has been a very important part of the natural drainage of the west side and the natural stormwater management of the whole Ashley Riverside, Riddlebank Park region of Charleston for many years. And so that 4 acres had to remain for flood storage and for stormwater storage for all these different years. And so now, we hear a lot about flooding problems that are caused by Gadsden Creek, and I know that, many of you have to live with this reality every couple of weeks when the tides are very high or when there's a heavy rain event. And we've heard it said that the creek is causing this flooding. But as you saw in the images that Seth shared, that old maps of the landfill and how the roads are interacting with the landfill, I want to be clear that the flooding is not being caused by Gadsden Creek, but rather the flooding is being caused because all that landfill, all that trash has been decomposing and settling for the last 50 years, and it's been sinking deeper and deeper into the pluff mud. And so it's not that the creek is flooding the road, it's that rather, instead, it's the road has been sinking by several feet over the last few decades. So as the road has been sinking, and the creek has been continuing to move water in and out twice a day, as it has for thousands and thousands of years. The creek is bringing in little bits of pluff mud from the river, and it's taking out water. This is what these tidal creeks do. It's continuing to do what it's always done, and the water levels in the creek have inched a little bit higher because of sea level rise, and the levels in the creek have inched higher because of all the work in the harbor, deepening the harbor, totally engineering the Charleston harbor. It brings more water into the harbor. And so that has made the water levels in the creek slightly higher. But the major impact has been, as the creek is inching higher, the road has been sinking down by several feet as that trash has decomposed, and the road hasn't been maintained, it hasn't been rebuilt, it hasn't been re-elevated to the original height that it was built. So it makes it seem as if the creek is flooding the road, when in reality that's not what's happening at all. And if you look there in the distance, in the very center of the image, over by the Citadel football stadium, you can see the little rise. And you can see it too, especially when it's flooded like this. If you stand in Haygood or drive down the road, you can see the rise in the land. And that little hill, and you know, we live in a place that doesn't have a lot of hills, so it's really obvious that little hill is where it transitions from those 100 acres of marsh that were filled and goes up onto the natural land where it's good, solid earth and not filled in trash. Originally, that was all leveled off, and that whole thing is sunk through the years. And so now, you know, we've heard it said that Gadsden Creek is just an old drainage ditch and so forth, but this is actually what Gadsden Creek looks like. It's a meandering creek that has all these natural forms and these little rivulets and the salt marsh grass. This is a very natural tidal creek that has reclaimed its natural territory and renaturalized over the last 50 years. And you see these natural forms, even as it's up against the road and the parking garage. We've really benefited from having some wonderful photos that have been taken by friends at Gadsden Creek and the overall community for the last several years. And I'm going to share some of those with you that I think really show what Gadsden Creek is today and how well it's recovered since the landfill activities ended in the 70s. So here's a view of Gadsden Creek along the parking garage, just near Haygood, and you can see the natural pools and the way the water is flowing through the marsh grasses, and you can see trees lining the creek. And this has all happened quite naturally. There hasn't been any creek restoration efforts in the past. This is just the creek coming back to life on its own. And that's something that I think is really important as we think about ideas to revitalize the creek, is that all we can do is just help the creek along. It's been healing itself over the last 50 or so years. If you get down into the creek, I've paddled the creek, I've walked the creek down in the mud many times. If you get down in the creek, you can still see evidence of work that was done years ago, like these pilings. At dead low tide, you can see these pilings where maybe there were some walls that were built to try to shore in Gadsden Creek years ago, or maybe there were some of the old dock pilings, but you can see the creek, you can see evidence of these old, pieces of infrastructure. But then if you look more closely, you see all this pluff mud, you see the Spartina grasses, and you see where the marsh has rebuilt itself after all these years. You don't see a landfill. You see this creek that is almost very fully recovered. You can see oysters, you can see thick layers of marsh sediments that have come from the Gadsden River twice a day, over and over again for 5 decades now, just like it's been doing for thousands and thousands of years. And another one of the really interesting plants you see is this saltwort, this sea bean. Has anyone ever had one of these before? Have eaten one? You can snap it off, and it's very salty. It's delicious. People eat them for a snack or on salad. I love finding them in the marsh and eating them. And these are all over the upper edges of Gadsden Creek. And this is something that's a very natural part of our salt marsh that you can see growing. And during some times of the year, they turn red, and it's just a beautiful blanket of red across the very edge of the salt marsh. Anyone know what this flowering plant is called at the edge of the marsh?
Oxeye daisy?
Sea oxeye daisy. Yeah, they bloom, these beautiful yellow flowers in May or June, depending on the year. And these plants grow at the very edge, the upper edge of the marsh, basically at the high tide line. These plants tell us like where the normal to high tide is. And you'll see this plant growing along both sides of Haygood, over by Harmon Field and also on the Gadsden Creek side. You'll see these growing because they need just a little bit of salt water, and they grow at that very edge. And they're beautiful during May and June. So in a couple of months, I encourage you all to look for these beautiful yellow flowers that grow along the edge of the marsh. Anyone ever seen fiddler crabs along Haygood or in the salt marsh there? Now, fiddler crabs are a really interesting part of Gadsden Creek because they are very picky. And fiddler crabs won't live just anywhere. They require clean water, and they require that the sediment be deep so they can dig their burrows down into the sediment. And fiddler crabs are interesting because when the high tide comes in, twice a day, fiddler crabs build a little door across the top of their burrow, and they go down inside of their burrow and they wait out the high tide, which I think is just amazing. They know how deep to dig the tunnel based on how much air they're going to need during high tide. So every day, twice a day, they make a little trap door, they go down into their burrow, and they wait out the high tide. And somehow they know when it's time to unplug it and come out. And so because of that, fiddler crabs are a very good indicator that the marsh is in good health, because they do not tolerate a lot of pollution. And so these fiddler crabs have been just growing across the marsh, and they're an important part of the marsh. And they tell us something about the quality of the marsh and the quality of the water. Because they wouldn't live in a place that was terribly polluted in the way that we've heard that the marsh is terribly polluted. Anyone know this bird? Have you seen this bird out of Gadsden Creek? It's a yellow-crowned night heron, and you can see on the right, it's enjoying a snack of a fiddler crab. And these are one of the many wading birds that you see up and down the creek of the channel of Gadsden Creek, especially during low tide if you walk that area. And then you see oysters growing in the bed of the creek. And they're not just oyster shells, they're oyster reefs that are growing year over year. And you can see on the edge of these shells the little white crown. That white edge is the oyster as it's growing year over year, getting a little bit larger. And again, they're another indicator of the water being salty and the water being quality enough for these oysters to grow year over year. And then you can see, we heard about raccoons, and sometimes you see raccoons down the creek trying to break open some of these oysters. And then you have egrets, all sorts of other wading birds that leave their beautiful tracks in the pluff mud and walk along the creek, and also roost in the trees that are along Gadsden Creek. And we know that there are not many trees in Gadsden Green generally, and Gadsden Creek and its marsh are the most high density of trees in the whole area. And so you see these shorebirds up in the trees, and you can see water oaks and cedar trees, and you can see a variety of species of trees that can live right there at the edge of the salt marsh. And again, those weren't planted, those are just trees that have come on their own. As the birds roost in the trees, they make their droppings and new trees grow. And this has been going on to now it's a fully fledged marsh, and we bring in these beautiful songbirds that maybe some of you hear from the marsh and from the trees around the marsh in the mornings, like this cardinal that was captured a couple of years ago. And so the National Marine Fisheries, maybe you've read this quote, they agree that the marsh and the creek are classified as fully functional. So these are a group of scientists. It is their job to assess the health of salt marsh, and they work for the federal government, and several years ago they said that they believe the marsh and creek would be classified as fully functional. And these pictures that I just shared, taken by some of our neighbors and friends, would also indicate that the marsh is fully functional. This is what we would expect to see in the marsh, and is what we do see in the marsh. And, this porpoise at the mouth of Gadsden Creek, enjoying forage that comes out of the creek, also would agree that this creek is fully functional. It's one of the few places where they can get these, shrimp and mud minnows and other small creatures and fish that come out of the mouth of the creek. They can cruise the bank of the Ashley and get this forage. So now I want to turn to talk about some ideas for Gadsden Creek, based on the work that I've been able to do, and also studying some other communities and what they've done in circumstances a lot like Gadsden Creek. And so this is a picture of Hyatt Park up in Columbia. And Hyatt Park is built along a creek in an area that has a lot of flooding problems. And the flooding problems were so bad that back in the 50s, this park, this is the same park, the same place, but you can see these concrete squares there. Those are boxes where the city many years ago filled in their creek back in the 50s because it was causing flooding. So they put the creek down in pipes back in the 50s. But that was causing more problems because when you put a creek in a pipe, it inevitably causes problems down the road. And that's what happened here. And so the creek was restored because the city put together some of their funds, and they got grant funds to take the pipes out. And you can see over on the right-hand side of the picture some old pipes, and those old pipes were the pipes that were in the ground, keeping the creek underground for a long time. And so this is some of the contractors excavating the creek, putting the creek back, building a new creek, putting the park. And I want to pause here and see if anyone has any reflections about this image. Is there anything that you see here that you particularly like, or that you could imagine being part of Gadsden Creek when it's revitalized?
What was that?
I can imagine all of that.
You can imagine all of that.
Yeah.
Me too.
Because they ain't got no basketball court,
Yeah.
and they ain't got no recreational below right here below shade.
Right?
That look like greenery in it.
You got some shade, yep.
I mean right here, that's greenery.
Right, the plants, trees, landscaping.
Then in those bleachers.
Benches, yeah.
That look like, that's what.
I agree, and I've been there, I've been to this park a lot through the last few years since it was built, and I'd love to see,
See, that
especially,
shade that they can put the low laundromat right there. Yeah.
Is that an
I know
intention,
how safe it can be, but it's just,
is that an intentional retention pond for flooding?
that's actually the creek.
Oh, that's the creek itself.
That's the creek itself.
So it is a natural retention pond.
It's a natural retention pond, right. When it floods, that creek, the water level rises by a couple of feet, and that's why there are the fences and the handrails put on the boardwalk and the fence over there by the basketball court for safety. But then during dry weather, the creek has a little bit of flow in the bottom, and then it's really nice after school to see, kids playing basketball or families or, groups of people out there, and it's right up against the creek, and so there's songbirds, and it just sounds like a creek
so
flowing.
the water's still high rise with the bricks and all of that down?
The water only rises a couple of feet, so it doesn't ever come up to that walkway.
Oh, so it's like a hose.
That's right. Yeah.
How high does it rise during a storm?
Just a couple of feet.
Just 2 feet.
Yeah, maybe if you were to get into it, maybe knee deep, waist deep at the most. So it's been designed so it's not any dangerous flow.
Alligators in it?
I haven't seen the alligators.
And you know it is creeks.
We heard of a beaver being in there, but we haven't seen the alligators.
Beavers.
Anything else? Any other ideas this gives you, or thoughts or questions
That
about?
looks good right there.
Does the walking trail follow the entire creek?
It does. Yeah, the walking trail follows. It's about 1,000 feet of creek. So if you go down and back, it's almost a half of a mile.
That looks good.
Okay, so I want to look at something a little bit larger. This is a project in Seattle, but this is a creek that's through a new development. So this is similar to what West Edge has proposed in terms of new buildings. You can see high-rise buildings and apartment buildings. And there's a creek that flows right through the middle of this development. And you can see on the left that, again, this area used to be a creek that was buried underground in pipes. And this is a trend, I want to point out several times, that communities many years ago used to put their creeks in pipes, but nobody's putting creeks in pipes anymore. That's the thing of the past. I literally only know of one person proposing to put a creek in a pipe right now, and it's Gadsden Creek. People put creeks in pipes decades ago, and it never works out well. And here's a good example in Seattle where a creek was put in a pipe under a parking lot, and now it's on this whole city block. They've daylighted the creek, brought it back to the surface, and used it for natural beauty and for habitat and also for flood storage. So this image here is just a zoom in of this image. So you can see some of these, there where the cursor is, you can see these little viewing platforms. So this image is from that spot. So same question, I wonder if there's anything here you could imagine, especially in areas where there's new buildings that are being built and near the creek. Can you imagine something like this being for Gadsden Creek? What do you see that you think can work well there?
A place for people to lounge, picnic table,
Sorry, I'm
shuffleboard.
going to give you a mic if you want to raise your hand if you have a question so everyone can hear.
Thank you, Seth.
Well, perhaps there could be recreational activities for people to just enjoy the overview of the creek, and perhaps maybe having a picnic lunch out there with some parasols, or even some maybe shuffleboard or some other types of activities, if that wouldn't interfere. But it's a place for people to enjoy being by the waterside.
Thank you. I agree.
It also makes me think, like, as a kid, I would love to, like, put on my rain boots and get out there and, like, go explore and get a little bit muddy and, like, learn about all the different plants and animals that are living in that creek just outside of your door.
Thank you. I feel the same way.
Any other questions or comments?
I want to point out one thing is that you can see these concrete walls, and if you look in the background, you can see these other concrete walls and this little block wall and these steps. And one thing I want to point out is this is all very engineered and designed very intentionally to offer, to provide all this flood storage. You can imagine that during a very big torrential rain or during a very large tide, imagine if this whole area were filled up with water, up to mid-level on this wall. Then it really would function like a retention pond. But that's a lot of water. You imagine something like this with walkways or buildings that are near Gadsden Creek. If you imagine the 4 acres of Gadsden Creek, if it were allowed to fill up in the way that a salt marsh fills up, just how much storage that could give us for tidal waters, but then also for heavy rain. Even if it were high tide and you get heavy rain, there's still lots of room for the water to go. And you can see, back to this image, that's for, 1,000 feet, because that's about how long Gadsden Creek is. That's a lot of water over that full distance. And then I want to settle on this image, and these images are also going to be in the cafeteria when we start doing some brainstorming together. But this is an image, this is not built, this is a computer rendering of a project that the city of Conway is working to build right now. And the city of Conway got flooded several times in the last few years, and they got a grant from FEMA to do some flood restoration work. And this is what they're going to put in the area that was flooded. There were several houses, they got flooded so badly they had to be demolished. And in place of those houses, they're going to build a new wetland park, something like this. So what do you see here, you could imagine, for Gadsden Creek?
The walkway.
The walkway is a boardwalk that goes right down into it.
Yeah, boardwalk.
Yeah. Ties into the sidewalk on the back. Trees, yeah. Yeah, lots of trees that are proposed to be planted here. And the other thing is that trees, each large mature tree uses hundreds of gallons of water every day. So not having trees in Gadsden Green is really two things at once. It's not giving you shade, but it's also not removing the water from the ground that helps the ground be ready to absorb rainfall next time it rains. Because the ground is like a huge sponge, and the things that pull the water out of that sponge are tree roots. And those trees the trees that are the size of the ones in this image, they use hundreds of gallons a day. And that's a big part of how the natural landscape works to prepare itself for different rain events.
And give us oxygen.
And gives us oxygen, right? Cleans the air, cleans the water, and provides that habitat that brings in the birds and other things that really help it feel like a natural place. Well, that's all the slides that I have, but I have a QR code here for a longer report that we put together a couple of years ago to prepare for the trial that I mentioned earlier, and look forward to talking with you all throughout the day through the workshops. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Seth. Are there any other questions or just general comments or anything about what I've showed you or other aspects of Gadsden Creek that I could help address?
Oh, yeah.
This is Louise Brown. She was one of the 12 women that led the NUSC hospital strike in 1969. So she's been fighting for social and economic justice in this area for over half a century. She is the only one of the 12 women from 1969 who's still an activist. And she's happy to be an activist during this year day.
What I would like to know, what are you going to do with the people? Why are you changing the name from Gadsden Green to Gadsden Creek? What is the purpose?
Well, I was just talking about Gadsden Creek as the creek itself, so I'm not at all proposing to change the name from Gadsden Green to Gadsden Creek. Gadsden Creek is part of Gadsden Green, so I'm here just talking about the creek itself.
Okay. When I grew up back here, there was always water back there, because I grew up on Gadsden Green. So I just wanted to know more about what you're planning to do with it, and what you're going to do with the people that's back there when you change the name. But you say you're not changing the name.
That's right, yes ma'am.
They want people to stay.
No, they don't.
Now, that's the other people, but they're fighting those people.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your question, Ms. Brown.
Any other questions or comments for Joshua?
Thank you.
Oh, we have one over here.
ask, just what do you think needs to happen so that you potentially have the possibility to kind of carry out the revitalization project? What does the city need to do, or what resources, what can make this happen? Obviously aside from stopping West Edge from developing it.
Yeah, so like, what can we do now at this point? I think, just like Seb said in the introduction, continuing to talk to city council and the mayor. We have a new council and a new mayor who are seemingly much more sympathetic to Gadsden Creek and are interested with an open mind and curious about what can be done. So this is a really good opportunity to voice our concerns and our ideas, not just concerns, but also ideas to the city council. We also, right now, there's a lot of funding available for flooding in coastal areas. There's a lot of funding available for communities that have been overlooked for many years. So there's a lot of targeted funds for restoring salt marsh. There are communities all around South Carolina that have received millions of dollars to do projects like Gadsden Creek. And that all has to start with, just like we're doing today, groups of people putting together their ideas on paper and advocating to the elected officials to put in these applications and ask for the dollars. And also for the city council itself to put the dollars into saving Gadsden Creek. Because we don't just have to wait for someone else to get funding. The old saying, where there's a will, there's a way. And as a community, as a city, we spend a lot of money on a lot of things. And we could choose to spend money on revitalizing and saving Gadsden Creek. So that's the big thing I say is just continue to share about Gadsden Creek. And then the other thing is these photos that I shared make me want to spend more time there. So to me, this isn't just some like high-level existential idea, but it's actually, we have a creek. There is the last remaining tidal creek, and it's beautiful in this way. So spending more time there, walking along it, taking photos, learning about it, it's actually really good for us. It gives us better health, better mental health. And the more time we're there, the more tours we have, the more people we're bringing to the creek, the more people that see it and fall in love with it. That's how we care for it. That's how this spreads to more people, is just taking that love for the place and helping it grow to others. So that's the other thing. It's not just about the activism, but also just enjoying it because we have it right now.
Got one over here.
One question about some of the funding and resources that are available. How much or how complicated does the pre-existing landfill, does that complicate any of the pursuits for revitalization? Like, I know there's funding available, but what I've heard some pushback is that the landfill complicates some revitalization efforts. Do you foresee any issues with that?
That's a really good question, because I think it's all in how, I've written a lot of these types of grant proposals, and it's all in how it's written, and the old landfill does complicate what needs to be done there, but in terms of putting together funding, I think there's a really strong case to be made that this is why funding should go to Gadsden Creek, because we have a marsh that has recovered so well in 50 years, but deep down, at 12 feet under the creek, there's still, decomposing garbage that something should be done to address, and it shouldn't be built upon. So I think that there's a way to create the revitalization project and put together funding proposals in a way that would address both. And I think that makes it stronger. Because some funding groups, each funding group has a target. Some of them want to provide money to projects that will improve habitat for a certain species. Others have funding for flooding. Others have funding for water quality. But the projects that have a little bit of all, those are the ones that get points. These are all just scored, just like tests in school. So the more points you get for what is the community, what is the human community that lives around the creek, and what is their relationship to the creek been. We have a great long history and a great community that's rallied around the creek, and we're here. So that's a big part of it. The landfill itself is even more incentive for why this should be done, because then it's not just about Gadsden Creek, but it's about the Ashley River. Because what we also have to be thinking about as a community is, even if Gadsden Creek has recovered, that trash, as it continues to decompose, it's underground, And it's any of that water that's under there that might have pollution in it. And we don't know, it's not been really measured, that's the other thing, it's not really been measured, we don't have data. But we know just theoretically that's moving out towards the river. So that's something that needs to be addressed, aside from Gadsden Creek. So anyway, that's just kind of some, you know, from the gut, some ideas of how it could actually improve, make it more competitive for some of these funds, in my opinion.
Any more questions or comments?